Hi, I'm Camille Dungy. I am so happy to be here. I have been working with and following CBOC kind of since the start, I think, and just to be in the room and hear all of these projects and see you as bodies in a room as opposed to ideas on a page is pretty exciting. So I'm going to start with a poem, actually. It's a poem of my own called Language. Silence is one part of speech. The war cry of wind down a mountain pass, another. A stranger's voice echoing through lonely valleys. A lover's voice, so close, it's your own tongue. These are keys to cipher. The way the high hawk's key unlocks the throat of the sky and the coyote's yip knots it shut. The way the aspen's bell measures the breeze and the rapid's drum defines resistance. Sage speaks with one voice, pinyon with another. Rock, wind her hand and water her brush, spells and then scatters her demands. Some notes tear and pebble our paths. Some notes gather, the bank we map our lives around. So I performed that poem some years ago at a conference in San Antonio, where Austin, where I then went and saw those bats immediately afterwards. And somebody came up to me after that reading and said, well, I never really thought about Black people writing about nature. Do you think that there's more of you doing that? And it was both a shocking and comical response. And my answer to his question became this book of about 300 pages of African-American poets writing on the natural world. Because that erasure, the omission of my presence and voice speaking with a connection to the environment seemed a dramatically dangerous erasure, right? What I just did in that poem, I'd been living on the East Coast of America away from my West, which was my home. And I went back for a visit and just was so happy on this hike to be back in a landscape I recognized. But I'm aware of the fact that often when people think about Black people living in America, they do not think about people going hiking in the chaparral, right? Which was my backyard, right? That was my landscape. So when I contacted people to be involved in the Black Nature Anthology, there were two key responses that I received. One response was, thank you. I've been doing this all along, and nobody has recognized me. They haven't included me in the anthologies. I've been separated. So when we go to the canon of nature literature, there were very, very few voices of color, very few women, very few voices that didn't represent a particular body that we expect to see in nature, right, or engaging with it. The other response was, I don't write nature poetry. Go find somebody else. This was often people who were writing either a poetic that was engaged in an agricultural setting, or that problematized questions of resource extraction, or talked about history in an African-American perspective, talked about history that was tied up with the history of enslavement and other kinds of historical cultural things. Or it would be people who were writing out of an urban setting, and they didn't write about nature. And I'm like, well, there's that poem you have about pigeons, right? But because that poem about pigeons was about how much you disliked pigeons, or the kind of engagement with pigeons in an urban setting, that's not a nature poem, because we've had this idea that nature poetry is this pristine, it's wilderness, it's pristine, it's something far out. Now the beauty is, Black Nature was published in 2009. The beauty is that in that intervening years, as we heard in the presentation that Dolly gave, like there's this like new idea with eco-criticism that there's an expanded view of who's writing about nature and how. And so there's many more engagements with questions is of resource extraction, human interactions with the world, what it means, the line, you know, I'm an American, there's the wall, right? The big wall question. And yes, I am very concerned about what that means in terms of the people who are and are not allowed to cross the wall, but I'm also really concerned about the non-human entities that are and not allowed to cross this border that had never existed before, right? There is no border for the mountain lion, except for the moment we put up an impenetrable 30-foot wall. There is, right? And so all these questions start to show up. As we expand and introduce new voices into the poetry conversation, the fiction conversation, creative nonfiction, we spread the word about this engagement and this crossover between different parts of our cultures, right? And different ideas about who our neighbors can be and what it means to expand our neighbors. But we also expand the conversation. So that means I get to talk to young children of color and say, your voice, your story, your narrative is relevant to this larger voice and story and narrative. And also, here are new things that you can be learning, right? And this is a way that I can put this learning into an exciting language that you are engaged with, right? And you're interested in. And so as we expand the ecopoetic and all the other arts, right? And we create this porous conversation and articulation and synthesis of how we see the world, and we allow in that expansion of who gets to have that story, I think the possibilities become endless and expansive and open in ways that I am, as you see, very excited about. I think that's about 7 minutes. Thank you.